If a landlord is looking to evict a tenant, there are many steps to follow. We walk through the process from order to possession of the unit by the landlord and the final window for the tenant to retrieve their belongings. In order to evict, the landlord must first have obtained an order from the Landlord and Tenant Board, also known as the LTB. The LTB eviction order will specify a date by which the tenant must vacate the rental unit. Wait for the deadline in the order to pass. The landlord cannot take any action until after the termination date. The tenant may leave on their own, or if they don't, the landlord can proceed to evict. It may be worthwhile to give a proper notice to enter for the morning after the termination date to inspect the unit. The tenant may have vacated without advising the landlord. There are a few ways to determine if the tenant has vacated. Did they turn in the keys? Is the unit empty of all personal items and furnishings? If in doubt, it's best to complete the eviction with the sheriff or seek a legal opinion before assuming the unit has been vacated. File a request for enforcement with the sheriff. If the tenant hasn't vacated by the date specified in the LTB order, the landlord must file the order with the local court enforcement office, also known as the sheriff's office, to enforce the eviction. The landlord must complete an application form and submit the original LTB order, along with a copy. Call the local sheriff's office in advance to ensure you know their specific hours of operation and rules for documentation required. Pay the sheriff's fees. The landlord is required to pay a fee for the sheriff to enforce the eviction. These fees vary by region, but typically range between $300 and $350. Payment must be made at the time of submitting the eviction documents to the sheriff. The sheriff's office may be able to give you an approximate timeline at the time of request. It ranges from municipality to municipality, generally from 2 to 12 weeks. Sheriff issues a notice of eviction to the tenant. The sheriff will review the LTB order and serve the tenant with a notice to vacate. This notice will give the tenant a specific deadline to leave the property, usually 7 to 10 days after the notice is served. The sheriff does not have to give any more notice beyond this. The sheriff will also inform the landlord of the date and time to meet at the rental unit to execute the eviction. Sheriff executes the eviction. If the landlord has not advised the sheriff that the tenant has vacated, the sheriff will meet the landlord at the specified date and time to remove the tenant. On the scheduled day, the sheriff will arrive at the property and remove the tenant, allowing the landlord to change the locks. The sheriff will sometimes give the tenant 15 to 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave. If they fail to do so, the sheriff can physically remove them or use police assistance to remove the tenant and all occupants at the residence. The landlord is not allowed to change the locks or take possession of the property until the sheriff has executed the eviction. Changing the locks. After the sheriff removes the tenant, the landlord must change the locks to prevent the tenant from re-entering. It's important to remember that the landlord cannot do this before the sheriff executes the eviction, as it would be considered an illegal eviction. The sheriff will post a notice on the door, which must remain in place for the specified duration listed on the notice. The landlord will be given a copy of this notice. The landlord will need to keep the copy of the notice in a safe place as proof of possession in case the tenant re-enters the unit illegally. Note, this is not legal advice. It is recommended if there are any challenges with the tenant illegally accessing the unit, then the landlord should seek competent legal advice. 72-hour rule for personal items. If the tenant has left personal property within the unit, the Residential Tenancies Act outlines a 72-hour window for the tenant to retrieve their belongings. The tenant may arrange a time to remove items within the window of 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. for the 72 hours post-eviction. The landlord must be reasonable with access to the unit and not interfere or impede the tenant from regaining possession of their items. The landlord must not put unreasonable limits on access to obtain items, or the tenant can sue the landlord for loss of personal property. It is prudent for the landlord to consider making repeated outreach to the tenant to arrange a suitable time to claim their personal items. Track all efforts made as evidence the landlord acted reasonably. Claiming personal property. When the tenant is accessing the unit to pack and/or retrieve their personal items, the landlord may wish to take precautions to ensure the integrity of the unit and the landlord's right to maintain possession of the unit. Consider engaging a security guard to remain in the unit, or have the landlord and another person remain in the unit to ensure the tenant does not simply lock themselves inside. If the tenant is hostile, aggressive, or threatening, consider contacting the police to keep the peace during the claiming of personal property. It is prudent for the landlord to take precautions to safeguard themselves and their unit. As always, seek legal advice when in doubt. Can an eviction be stopped? Evictions can be stopped a number of ways. The tenant could pay the entire amount owing, including filing fees, right up until the time the locks are changed. Payment in full would stop the eviction. The tenant could file a motion to set aside the eviction order before the sheriff enforces it. This could delay the process. The landlord should monitor for any such motions. In rare cases, a sheriff may decline to evict for an exceptional reason. If this occurs, it is recommended you seek legal advice immediately. By following these steps, landlords in Ontario can legally enforce an eviction with the sheriff after obtaining an LTB order. Like and subscribe for more helpful content. Like and subscribe for more helpful content.